Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm back with a new video in my series Units of Total War Rise of Mordor, with the faction we're focusing on today being one of my favourites, Rohan. If you're new to the channel, in this series I look at a faction in the mod Rise of Mordor for the game Total War Attila, the mod linked in the description, going over the history of the faction within the books and films of Tolkien's universe, before looking at the real-life civilizations that inspired them. After that, I look at the units of the faction, discussing their battlefield role as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic the units are. Now that you understand what topics the video is going to cover, let's look at the history of Rohan. Originally, the land that would become Rohan was inhabited by the people who would become the Dunlendings. However, that territory would fall under the control of Gondor, and would become its northernmost region, Calenarden. While for millennia this land was held by Gondor, as the years went by, the region, even at the best of times not really densely populated, would begin to see its population shrink, as endless wars against the Easterlings, Haradrim, contenders to the throne, and plague sapped the strength of Gondor. As the Third Age went on, Gondor would forge alliances with the Northmen, close relatives of the Men of Dale, who would fight loyally alongside the kingdom. However, as Gondor failed, the Northmen of Rhovanion were defeated and scattered by the Wainriders of the East, with one remnant of these people becoming the Aetheid, a culture known for their skill as horsemen and the ancestors of the Rohirrim. In the coming centuries, the Aetheid would grow and become successful, until their leader Eorl would receive summons from the Steward of Gondor, Cirion, begging for help from Gondor's ancient allies, as the kingdom seemed ready to collapse at the hands of the Balcroth raiders, who had conquered the depopulated region of Calenarden and were flogging Gondor's armies. Meeting the Easterlings in battle, all seemed lost for Gondor until out of the mist came a force of horsemen from the north, the Aetheid remembering their forebears' ancient alliance with Gondor and answering it. With their intervention, the Easterlings and their Orc allies were defeated and Gondor saved. As a reward for their valiant service, and as a way of ensuring Gondor would have a powerful ally, Cirion would gift empty Calenarden to the Aetheid, forging a bond between the two peoples and establishing the kingdom of Rohan. For the following 5 centuries Rohan would endure, sending men to fight alongside Gondor, while also facing constant clashes with the Dunlendings, jealous of those who they had considered to have stolen their ancestral lands. Another greater threat would rise to imperil the Rohirrim, a threat they had invited with open arms, the White Wizard Saruman. By the end of the Third Age and during the events of Lord of the Rings, Saruman had put much effort into his corruption of Rohan, using his sorcery to enslave King Theoden's mind, while his dark forces bled the kingdom of its best and brightest, including the son of the king, Theodred, who died fighting against invading Uruk-hai and Orcs. With the intervention of Gandalf the White and the Three Hunters, King Theoden would be freed, and would quickly act to defend his crumbling kingdom, fighting against the power of Saruman at the Battle of Helm's Deep, before directly confronting Saruman himself. Soon after, Rohan would ride to war, gathering its forces to fight against the armies of Sauron at the Pelennor Fields, where without their intervention, the capital of Gondor would have fallen. In this titanic battle, King Theoden would die a hero, killed by the Witch King of Angmar after defeating the heavy horse of Harad, while his niece Eowyn would be the one to destroy the leader of the Nazgûl. In the aftermath of the largest battle of the Third Age, the new king of Rohan, Eomer, nephew to Theoden, would join his remaining forces with those of Gondor for a last throw of the dice, marching on the Black Gate of Mordor to draw out its forces, so as to clear the way to Mount Doom for the Ring-Bearer. Following the destruction of Sauron, the Rohirrim would remain staunch allies of the newly forged reunited kingdom, helping Aragorn to subdue those Haradrim and Easterlings still willing to fight for Sauron's legacy. With the history of Rohan in universe covered, we'll turn to its depiction in the films and the books. In both, Rohan is depicted very much as a culture that revolves around horses, its main strength in battle being its superb cavalry, and its land being comprised of open rolling plains perfect for breeding quality horse flesh. In terms of historical cultures, the one that Rohan draws most strongly on for inspiration are the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain, essentially being Anglo-Saxons who specialize in heavy cavalry, something that is the complete opposite of the real-life culture, who instead almost entirely relied on infantry, with horses being used as a way of transport rather than battle. Because the Rohirrim are so clearly based off of this civilization, there's a clear difference between them and the men of Gondor, who technologically appear to be in a mix between ancient Rome and the late Middle Ages, while the Rohirrim instead have a technology level roughly equivalent with that of the 9th century. Other cultures who may have inspired Rohan include the Poles, especially with the performance of their shock cavalry at the siege of Vienna, breaking through the lines of the besieging Turks, and also the Visigoths, who fought alongside the Romans against the Huns, with the leader of the Visigoths, Theodoric, dying in the titanic clash at the Battle of the Catalanian Plains. With Rohan as a faction now covered, let's turn to its units, beginning with one of its general units, King Theoden, and his Knights of the House of Eorl. Now, before we get into the unit itself, we have to discuss the many potential general units Rohan can field. Compared to some other factions who have 1 or 2 general units available to them, Rohan has access to 7, 3 of which are unique hero units, meaning that they can only be used as general units, meaning all 3 can't be used in the same army. Those 3 unique hero general units are based off of a standard unit that can serve as a general, however, with its officer being a named character. For Aemma, the nephew of King Theoden, the unit that he leads are a special version of the Knights of the Mark, while King Theoden and his son, Prince Theodred, each lead special units of the Knights of the House of Eorl. I intend to show off each individual special general unit, so we'll start by looking at arguably my favourite character in Tolkien's Legendarium, King Theoden. Leading an elite unit of shock cavalry, Theoden leads from the front upon his white horse Snowmane, the rest of his men also riding white horses. Looking at Theoden himself, he wears a helmet which looks like a classic segmented Anglo-Saxon helmet, made of different pieces with adjustable cheek guards. Helmets with moving parts are most definitely historical. However, the more pieces of metal a helmet is made of, the less structural integrity it has, compared to helmets that are forged out of a single sole piece of metal. Theoden's helmet is engraved and decorated with gold, as befits a king, with a gilded horse crest upon the helmet. Turning to the rest of his panoply, he wears a red silken shirt as an undergarment, over which he wears a segmented plate armor cuirass, covered and highly decorated with leather and gold, the leather acting as another layer of defense which keeps the structure of the cuirass more solid, akin to a brigandine. The gold engraved onto the breastplate is in the shape of 2 horses, which makes a lot of sense for the king of Middle-earth's most prolific horse users. Atop his cuirass, he has a gorget which appears to be either even with his breastplate or slightly atop it. Either way, it's inaccurate for it to be there. Instead, it should be beneath his cuirass. Protecting his upper legs, he has scale folds, split in the middle like mail coats used by horsemen, some of the scales being gilded to show off his wealth. Protecting his shins are ornate greaves, while his arms are covered in large segmented pauldrons identical in style to his cuirass, while his forearms are covered in gilded vambraces, with him wearing riding gloves instead of metal gauntlets. While the armor looks cool and sets Theoden apart from the other Rohirrim, there are some issues with the armor. Historically speaking, his cuirass is too advanced for a people based off the Anglo-Saxons, instead being more similar to later types of plate armor used in the 14th century. You can explain that away, though, as Theoden utilizing his connections with Gondor to get more advanced armor that still retains kinship with the armor used by his people. One thing that can't be explained is the fact that Theoden's armor has massive weaknesses caused by him using no mail, the most ubiquitous armor used by Anglo-Saxon warriors and by the Rohirrim. When plate armor was used, mail was incorporated as a way of defending the body from attacks in areas plate armor couldn't work, such as the underarms. Theoden instead just has plate armor and scale armor defending some of his body, while he has gaps that could easily be defended with mail, something that doesn't make sense for a literal king to lack. Looking at his sword and shield, Theoden lacks a shield, although that may be because there's a glitch in the mod or something that's yet to be added by the modders. In-universe, he does have a shield similar to those used by his entourage, being more oval-shaped and more ornate. As for his weapon, he wields a sword named Herogrim rather than a lance, a blade with an amazing hilt with a crossguard in the shape of 2 horses. As a sword, Herogrim is a Viking-era single-handed sword, the type of weapon that would evolve to become the standard arming sword of the Middle Ages. So as a sword, Theoden's weapon looks pretty authentic. Turning to his horse, it's very well armored, covered in scale barding with a layer of leather over the top for more protection and shaping. Protecting the horse's head is plate armor interwoven with leather, making his horse and the other horses of the unit very well armored, being more akin to Central Asian and Middle Eastern heavy cavalry rather than Western European heavy cavalry armor. Because this unit is comprised of knights of the House of Eol, I'll only look at the armor of this unit and skip over the entourage of the other unique hero units. These warriors are just as heavily armored as King Theoden, if not more so, utilizing the same segmented plate and leather combination as their officer, being inlaid with silver rather than gold, while combined with their cuirass is a gorget just as inaccurately located as the king's. As for their helmets, they possess very stereotypical Anglo-Saxon helmets with the adjustable cheek guards, as well as delineated armor around the eyes, giving them a more imposing look, a type of style also commonly associated with the Vikings, a group of people who the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain had quite a lot of contact with. An interesting thing to note with this unit is that all of its members have red horsehair crests atop their helmets, and wear red clothes beneath their armor, perhaps as a way of showing kinship with their king and his motif of red rather than the standard green of Rohan. One way in which these troops are superior to Theoden is that underneath their armor they wear mail coats, helping to give them a second layer of defense, but also protecting weak points that Theoden's armor left undefended. Looking at their horses, they're identical to Theoden's mount in terms of armor, so we'll turn to their weapons and shields. For their shields, they have large round wooden shields covered in green lacquer, shields that wouldn't look out of place in an Anglo-Saxon or Viking shield wall, given it's based off of shields of that era. One thing that I have to applaud the mod creators for is the fact that the shield doesn't have a metal rim, something that you often see in shields and something that is very much not historical. To round out the shield's appearance, it has gold or bronze decoration added to it. If bronze, that would make a lot more sense than gold, while also having a central metal boss that is also highly historically accurate. Turning to their weapons, the Knights of the House of Eol use spears as lances, which is very much based in history, the lances used by medieval knights being developments of spears used by earlier cavalry in Europe. This spear looks very much like a thrusting weapon, designed to stab rather than slash, with metal cutouts within the spear tip itself. In-universe, the explanation for this is that because Rohan as a land is fairly poor in metals, the Rohirrim try to use as little metal as possible when making their weapons, while also trying to keep them as effective as possible, essentially cutting extra weight that can be used for other weapons. In terms of historical accuracy, as far as I know, it's inaccurate, although the idea of retaining structural stability while reducing mass is a sound one. Some spears are known with small cutouts on their edges, but not with entire holes within the spear tip. With Theoden and his unit looked at, let's turn to their battlefield role. As a general unit, they're definitely iconic and give you the sensation of leading the armies of Rohan via their leader, something only a few factions can really claim. While weak to pikes and spears due to their status as cavalry, ranged units can go from being highly threatening to barely a threat due to the strong armor of the unit. On the charge, they can absolutely decimate other cavalry units as well as infantry units stuck in battle, or caught out in the open. While some shock cavalry units tend to do poorly in melee after being left among enemy infantry, this unit can do very well, although as a general unit, it's smarter not to put your general in peril, and to instead use him as a mobile reserve, something this unit exceeds at. That said, there are other general units for the faction that come close to rivaling Theoden and his Knights of the House of Eol, and who are more cost effective, so while this is my favourite general unit for the faction, and probably any faction honestly, Rohan's other generals are highly useful as well. We'll now look at another one of the potential general units of Rohan, Prince Theodred and his own retinue of Knights of the House of Eol. Theodred, the son of Theoden, dies fighting against the forces of Saruman before his father is freed by the powers of Gandalf, essentially acting as the military leader of Rohan until his death. Looking at the prince, he is equipped similarly to his father, wearing a similar helmet and body armor, having the same inaccurate gorget placement, the main differences being that underneath the cuirass he wears a mail shirt, while the colour of his tunic and the leather on his cuirass is green rather than the red of Theoden. Unfortunately for the prince, like his father, he lacks a mail coif. However, he does have a helmet at least, something officers of other units often discard. Looking at his sword and shield, his shield is identical to that of his retinue, and his blade is his father's Herugrim, which suggests that after his father lost his independence, Theodred picked up the weapon of Theoden, fighting in the king's place until his death and his father's recovery, who in turn picked up the blade used by his young self and his fallen son. Looking at his horse's armor, Theodred's horse's barding is identical to that of Theoden's, being leather over the top of scale, However, instead of plate armor to defend the horse's face, it has lighter leather armor, something that was used historically, with this example being engraved with silver as a way of showing off the royal rider of the steed. Turning to the Knights of the House of Eorl, the riders in this unit are equipped almost identically to those of King Theoden, using the same spears, shields, and armor. The only differences being that their horses have leather armor for face protection, just like Prince Theodred's, with a few having scale or mail. With this unit looked at, we'll jump to the last unique general unit that Rohan can field, which can only be used as a general unit, Éomer and his Knights of the Mark. Éomer, the nephew of King Theoden, serves as one of the chief enemies of Saruman and his agents in their struggle to weaken Rohan, often advocating for war and killing those dark servants who would invade the Riddermark. Serving as a faithful lieutenant of his uncle, Éomer would eventually become the king of Rohan after the death of Theoden. In his unit portrayal in the game, as a way of showing his initial status compared to his royal uncle and cousin, the unit that Éomer leads are the Knights of the Mark rather than the Knights of the House of Eorl, the Knights of the Mark being a lesser, if still powerful option for general. Looking at Éomer's equipment, he wears a very Anglo-Saxon inspired helmet with a horse-shaped nasal crest as a way of showing what culture he comes from. Flowing from the back of his helmet is a white horsehair crest. His highly decorated cuirass, engraved with silver, looks to have a single breastplate encased in leather rather than the segmented plate of Theoden and Theodred, perhaps indicating his greater role as a warrior compared to his contemporaries. Underneath his cuirass he has a mail shirt, while underneath that he has scale folds to protect his upper legs. For his lower legs he has decorated plate greaves, something that weren't utilized during the Viking era as far as I know. Protecting his upper arms are plate pauldrons similar in style to his breastplate, with more armor attached to them to extend their protectiveness. Finally, he has plate vambraces protecting his lower arms. Looking at his sword, it's a textbook example of a Viking-era sword, with a stumpy crosspiece and pommels typical of the time. His shield is large and round, with a central metal boss, being decorated with white horses, essentially being in the style of shields that were in common service during the early Middle Ages throughout Europe. Éomer's horse is identically equipped to Theodred's, as are the rest of the steeds of the Knights of the Mark, so we'll skip their horses and move on to the knights themselves. In terms of helmets, all of their designs are Anglo-Saxon and Viking inspired, all having large cheek guards or having a mix of rings around the eyes for protection or large bars across the face to protect the face. Other helmets that jump to mind are the Gallic-style Roman legionary helmet and its descendant, the late Roman ridge helmet, both of which had the same rough design with flexible cheek guards, the late Roman ridge helmet itself being the ancestor of the helmets that would proliferate throughout Europe following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, some of those helmets being the Anglo-Saxon helmets that were direct inspirations for this unit. For body armor, they tend to have coats of scale armor protecting the torso and legs, similar to that used by steppe people, and even the Roman Empire, who in fact did use scale armor for both its legionaries and its auxiliaries. Over this scale they have large engraved gorgets, which are of course over the armor rather than under it, making it an odd mishmash of historical styles, while protecting their lower legs are greaves. For their arms, they have the same pauldrons, upper arm armor, and vambraces as Éomer. For weapons, they use the same spear as the Knights of the House of Eorl, while their shields are smaller, something common in cavalry who would often carry smaller counterparts to infantry equipment. These smaller shields are also less ornate than those of the Knights of the House of Eorl, sharing the same central boss, but lacking the gilding on the royal unit's shields, instead having paint for decoration, with patterns of white horses and suns being common. As a general unit, Éomer's Knights of the Mark are somewhat lesser to Theoden and Theodred's retinues, still being shock cavalry but not being quite as heavy or effective. That said, Éomer and his men make up for that by being less expensive, so there are some advantages. Overall, Éomer's unit is quite effective as shock cavalry, and still makes for a good general unit, easily being capable of turning the tide of battle, while also allowing you to play as another notable warrior and leader of Rohan. With Éomer's Knights of the Mark looked at, let's move on to the first of Rohan's infantry units, and the only sword and shield infantry the faction has, the Sword Thanes. Looking at their armor, you can very clearly see the Anglo-Saxon and Viking inspiration for the unit, which wouldn't look out of place in a unit lineup for Total War Thrones of Britannia. Looking at their helmets, they have composite helmets in the Anglo-Saxon style, some using leather helmets with little metal, while others have a more even match of metal and leather components to their helmets, while others have metal helmets covered in leather. All these variations being types of styles of helmets used during the Viking era, especially by less affluent warriors who couldn't afford metal helmets. The helmets often have a horse motif somewhere to be found, which is cool to see. Society-wise, that's something to note. This unit is closer to ancient Greek hoplites in terms of social positioning rather than knights, being more affluent parts of society such as merchants, traders, well-off farmers, and professional soldiers from the lower classes caught up to defend their communities, rather than very wealthy elite warriors trained from young to dominate the battlefield. Turning to their armor, they wear a mix of styles, some having mail shirts or coats over flowing clothes, while others have scale cuirasses, armor types that were commonly in use, not just in the Viking era, but throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages, being used ubiquitously by different cultures, scale more being associated with the East rather than the West, where mail was more prevalent, although scale too was in use at different points in Europe, historically, while others have plate vambraces, technology of the 14th century compared to their 9th century appearance, while others have no vambraces at all. Protecting their lower legs, they have greaves, or finishing off the look are green cloaks. Cloaks often being used in history as an additional way of keeping warm and as uniforms for intimidation or showing allegiance. For defense, they all use wooden shields with central bosses, covered in symbols of Rohan such as horses and sunbursts. For swords, they're all equipped with Viking-era single-handed swords, weapons which, while capable of stabbing to some degree, were made more for slashing and cutting. For a unit of this level, not being elite yet not being militia, it makes sense for them to be equipped with swords, as swords were more commonly used by the more wealthy in society, especially during the Viking era, where they were the symbol of a warrior, being a tool entirely devoted to the battlefield, unlike spears, axes, and bows, which would all be used for either hunting or work purposes. For a unit meant to go into a clash of shield wars, it makes sense for them to use a weapon capable of being quite effective in that situation, more so than spears, which could be quite cumbersome. Looking at their officer, he's a guard of the Golden Hall, wearing a far more ornate helmet made entirely of metal, a coat of scale armor, a beautifully decorated gorget, and pauldrons of scale. Completing his armor are ornate vambraces and greaves. He utilizes the same type of shield as his troops, while his weapon is a sword rather than a spear, like the standard guard of the Golden Hall. A sword which is similar to his men in appearance, being far better equipped than his subordinates. Overall, as a unit, the sword thanes are quite useful for Rohan, filling the gap of melee infantry and allowing Rohan to use them in that role, either on the defensive or on the offensive, rather than dismounting cavalry units and using them, a far more expensive and wasteful option. In battle, these troops do fairly well against militia and other medium infantry, making a sturdy battle line. However, against shock infantry and cavalry, they don't do quite as well. Against archers they fare decently due to their armor and shields, although because they're not elite, enough volleys by ranged units can prove fatal. This isn't a starting unit for Rohan, but for mid-tier and elite armies, this unit will definitely have a place. Overall, a unit I recommend using as Rohan, as it gives you much needed flexibility, although with it being your only melee sword and shield infantry, you have to rely on them constantly as part of the anvil against which enemy forces are to be smashed by the hammer of Rohan's cavalry, even when they are being outmatched by enemy units. Moving on from the sword thanes, we come to the first of Rohan's axe infantry, the mustard axes. This militia unit is made up of light axemen, wearing a mix of leather helmets, some being the same as those used by the sword thanes, while others are closer to leather skullcaps. For body armor, they all wear leather, some having leather cuirasses while others wear leather in lamellar style over the top of their normal clothing, being regular shirts in the color of Rohan, red and green, regardless of the styles of the armor. While leather armor itself is historical, it was rarer than textile armor. While it makes sense for the unit not to have brigandines, given these are militia and brigandines were more for actual soldiers rather than conscripted peasantry, giving them gambeson for protection instead would have been a better choice, although that said, padded textile armor isn't known to have been in use during this time, due to a lack of evidence. Either way, while any choice of armor for this unit would have relied on speculation from a historical standpoint, Speculative armor like gambeson would have been a better choice in my opinion, rather than leather, although that said, historical accuracy wasn't something the mod developers were going for. All I'm saying is that while the Rohirrim are based off of the Anglo-Saxons, don't take this depiction to mean that lesser Anglo-Saxon troops would have used leather armor on a wide scale. Continuing with their armor, a few have leather folds protecting their crotch, while others have leather pauldrons, also something that didn't really exist. Turning to their weapons, they use large one-handed axes, with curved tips perfect for catching weapons and disarming enemies. Many of these axes have been skeletonized like the spears of the cavalry we've looked at, meaning that a lot of their mass has been removed. A cool idea, but still ahistorical, especially for a weapon that relies on mass to deliver damage. While axes in the shape of these were used historically, they weren't really used in the hands of militia, instead being used by professional soldiers and knights in the High Middle Ages. For a unit like this, a hatchet that doubles for use in civilian life would be a better choice rather than a pure military weapon from centuries in the future. With their axes, they have round shields with central bosses, some of them having leather lining on the outside of the shield, which was done historically rather than metal, which wasn't. While shields of this size were used historically, it doesn't make sense for a unit so lightly equipped to use shields smaller than the shield thanes, who are far more heavily armoured. Typically, the less well-equipped combatants were, the larger a shield they'd bring to the battlefield to defend them, which is why you see shield size become smaller as the medieval period continued. Their officer is a standard guard of the Golden Hall, so we'll skip him and move on to the unit's role. As an axe militia unit, these guys will be a vital part of early tier Rohan builds, serving in your front lines as half infantry, half shock troops, with the capabilities their axes give them. With their shields and armor as they have some resistance against archers, although cavalry is highly lethal when used against them. While they are useful against other low-tier units like Orc Rabble, the unit definitely should be phased out when possible by other Rohirrim infantry, including the next axe unit that Rohan brings to the battlefield, and a clear improvement over the mustard axes, the Axe Thanes. In terms of appearance, these troops are identical to the Sword Thanes, using the exact same set of helmets, mail and scale shirts, and round shields, the only difference being their weapons, being the same axes used by the mustard axes. Their officer is yet another guard of the hall. On the battlefield, these guys are a clear step up from the mustard axes, serving on the front lines, being a vital part of any mid and high tier Rohan army, serving in conjunction with sword thanes as your main assault infantry when going on the offensive, in battles on open fields and when storming enemy fortifications. When placed on the defensive, they're effective troops in their own right, being capable of holding the line in general, while the nature of their weapons means they can be used as quasi-shock infantry when needed. Against ranged units they fare fairly well, being able to withstand ammunition due to their body armor and shields, although not as much as more heavily armored elite troops. When playing Rohan, I recommend getting these troops as quickly as possible, as they help fill out Rohan's armies, replacing the mediocre mustard axes and giving Rohan infantry options that are much needed, especially given that Rohan lacks shock troops, this unit somewhat filling that role. With the axe thanes covered, we'll now move to the first of Rohan's spear units, the mustard spears. When looking at their armor, it's clear that they're equipped almost identically to the mustard axes, being their spear equivalent. However, there are some differences. In terms of helmets, while they do share the same helmet as the mustard axes, some of them have even more bare-bones looking leather helmets, looking quite akin to the Montefortino helmets, more basic Roman helmets widely used for centuries, the only real difference being that these helmets are leather rather than metal like their historical counterparts. Some of the troops in this unit also don't wear helmets, and instead have mail coifs for head protection, something that was very commonly done in the Middle Ages, although very few of these troops have fitted coifs, perfect for defending the face, instead having unfitted coifs, which waste metal and weight on extra mail links, and which end up being less defensive overall. The reason for this could be that as a militia unit, they're unable to obtain tailored mail and instead use armor salvaged in the aftermath of battle or belonging to family and friends. Given their shields are identical to those of the mustard axes, we'll turn to their spears. They use various designs, some being spears with the tips having metal cutouts, something we've discussed before, while others have spear tips more in the shape of arrows or javelins with barbs, which is weird given these are thrusting spears, not javelins to be thrown at the enemy. Their officer is a guard of the Golden Hall, so we'll skip him and get into the unit's role. For early tier builds, this unit is an absolute must-have, being a core of Rohan's army. As a spear unit, while they may be lacking when on the offensive against enemy fortifications, especially given their militia status, when defending fortifications and holding the line in battle, these troops are crucial. As spearmen, their role is to pin down enemy infantry while your superior cavalry defeats any enemy cavalry and then wheels behind to take the enemy infantry in the rear, a strategy Rohan exceeds at, a strategy that will fail without these men being included in an army. In melee against militia troops and enemy rabble, this unit does well, although expecting them to get large numbers of kills is wishful thinking. Against ranged units they do fairly alright with their shields, although their lack of armor hurts them, while against cavalry they're quite effective, even being a threat to elite cavalry. If attacked in the flank or rear by cavalry, this unit will break though, belying their militia usage, while attacks from the front by super heavy cavalry units or being swarmed by cavalry in frontal charges can break their formations and lead to slaughter. Overall, a highly useful unit that will provide a significant portion of your initial infantry force, and even later on in the game can be useful as a support unit. However, the spear line of Rohan does have better units available to it, such as the Eorling men-at-arms. Looking at this unit, you can immediately tell they're far more professional than the mustard spears, being career soldiers in Rohan's armies. For helmets, they tend to have fully metal helmets in the typical Anglo-Saxon style. However, some warriors continue to use the composite leather and metal helmets instead. For body armor, every man has a scale hauberk, which while quite nice to look at, is a bit odd, given they all have riders' splits for their legs, something that was unnecessary for infantry. Returning to their armor, they have scale pauldrons as well as plate vambraces for their forearms, with their lower legs being protected by greaves. For a weapon, they have the same spears as the mustard spears, while their shields are far more interesting, using ovaloid shields rather than round ones. During the Viking Age, oval shields were used, however circular shields appeared to be far more common. A shield that this shield reminds me of is the scutum, particularly versions of it utilized widely by the tribes of Italy and the Celts, but most famously by the Romans, originally being oval-shaped before becoming rectangular for centuries, before near the end of the Roman Empire transitioning back to its original oval shape. The shields in this mod are decorated with yellow symbols as well as white horses, being far more reminiscent of Celtic art rather than legionary shield designs, the central bosses and metal rims being historically accurate, given that this style of shield did have metal rims, unlike medieval shields which lacked them. Their officer is yet another guard of the Golden Hall, resplendent in his fancy armor. Looking at this unit's role, they're the infantry corps of mid-tier and elite armies, being complete improvements over the mustard spears. On the battlefield, they fulfill the exact same role as the mustard spears, just to a greater degree of effectiveness, being more capable of going toe-to-toe with more dangerous professional units, and capable of destroying militia units when faced off with them. Ranged units tend to have some difficulty dealing with them due to their extensive armor and large shields, while cavalry is at a severe disadvantage when fighting this unit, unless attacking it from the rear, when just like any other unit, there's a good chance of them breaking. I absolutely recommend using this unit. While they may not be a dense block of infantry which carves up enemy armies like a sword, they are the anvil against which the enemy forces will be smashed by the riders of Rohan. An absolutely phenomenal unit and one of the best representations of Viking Age warriors ready to enter battle in scale armor that this mod has. We'll now turn to the ultimate unit in Rohan's spear line, the Guard of the Golden Hall. These troops, the sentinels of Rohan's royal residence, and the bodyguards of King Theoden, are seen quite often in the Lord of the Rings films, being stationed at Edoras, Rohan's capital, and fighting at the Battle of Helm's Deep/the Hornburg. Beginning with their helmets, they have very ornately decorated Anglo-Saxon helmets, with adjustable cheek plates, armored rings around the eyes, and a sculpted horse crest on their helmet with black hair coming from it. For body armor, they're equipped identically to the other unit's officers, having scale hauberks, plate pauldrons, vambraces, and greaves, as well as gorgets, the gorgets also being reminiscent of those worn by officers in the 18th and 19th centuries. For shields, They have the same ornate shields as Theoden and Theodred's riders, while their spears have a central ridge for strength while still having a central cutout as well. One thing to note is that their spears are partially wrapped in leather, as a way of making them easier to grip. Their officer is the same as the other officers, so we'll turn to the unit's role. As ultra-elite spearmen, these troops are very useful as supporting units for high-quality Rohirrim armies, being incapable of being the core of Rohan's armies, due to limits on how many of this unit can be fielded. In terms of battlefield strength, this unit can fight against just about anything, being capable of holding the line almost endlessly unless outflanked or surrounded, withstanding enemy projectiles to a high degree, and being a serious menace to enemy cavalry. This unit can also serve as a general due to its elite status, and when doing so is highly suited for siege battles, as a defender, when the unit's natural strength will make it a linchpin of any attempt at holding positions. I highly recommend using this unit as either a bulwark on the battlefield or as reinforcements for your main line when it's threatened, while as a general, it excels in some situations more than others, having extreme durability even when used on open battlefields, although as a mobile reserve to capitalize on holes in the enemy lines, they're somewhat less than your best option. Ultimately an amazing unit that I recommend any Rohirrim general use when possible. With this unit covered, all of Rohan's fairly limited melee infantry options have been looked at, so we'll turn to their ranged units, beginning with the mustered archers. These militia archers are equipped the same as the other militia units when it comes to armor, the only difference being their lack of shields and weapon choice. For their main weapon, they have what I consider a hunting bow or maybe a war bow more than anything else, or for melee combat they have an assortment of daggers and axes. Skipping to their officer, who's a standard Rohirrim officer, we'll turn to their battlefield role, a basic block of any Rohirrim army. These guys give your troops much needed range support early on in the game, helping to thin out enemy units and being somewhat effective in killing low tier enemies, even if they aren't great archers. Against more professional infantry with better shields and armor they'll struggle, but for the job that they're meant for, they do quite well. For defending early fortifications, they're vital, which combined with their overall usefulness means that you should use this unit whenever possible, although phasing it out is a good idea, given that while they may be somewhat mediocre in ranged combat, although capable of defeating other starting archers, in melee they're mostly hopeless. Moving up the tree in terms of quality, we come to the Yeomen of the Mark, who will be the bulk of your ranged forces for the game once you unlock them, being far more heavily armoured than the mustered archers. For helmets, many of these troops have standard Anglo-Saxon helmets, while others have mail coifs for protection, hopefully with padding beneath it for their sake. Turning to their body armour, all have either mail shirts or hauberks, over the top of which are leather cuirasses, a combination that is historical. Protecting their arms they have leather braces, which makes sense for archers to have, or protecting their legs are sturdy boots, or for a few lucky soldiers, leather greaves. For weapons, this unit uses longbow as their main, having axes used by other units as a backup melee weapon. Their officer is as standard as the rest. In terms of battlefield use, this unit is the standard medium range unit that Rohan has available to it, essentially meaning that it will see use in almost all of Rohan's armies. Unluckily for Rohirrim generals, while this unit is better than the mustered archers, it isn't by much, being somewhat overshadowed in terms of quality by the mid-tier archers fielded by other factions. While they do their part, they aren't quite as exceptional as one would hope. They aren't very accurate, and in archery duels can begin to suffer if facing off against more professional archers. When out of arrows, this unit can be pressed into the midst of battle as a melee unit, doing somewhat better than the mustered archers, although not by much, the best strategy for this unit being to attack the enemy from the rear as a way of overcoming this unit's poor melee skills. While so far Rohan's ranged units have been unimpressive, the next archer unit somewhat alleviates that unit being the garrison of the Hornburg. These professional troops are stationed in the Hornburg/Helm's Deep as its permanent garrison, quite different to most Rohirrim warriors, who were raised as an army only for limited service, while also being pretty unique in terms of its battlefield role in the faction roster. For their helmets, they wear much of what we've seen before, being somewhat more decorated as a way of showing their elevated status, with a mail coif beneath their helmets for extra protection, extending to their shoulders as a way of protecting their upper chest. For armor, they wear a mix of scale coats, mail coats, and scale shirts, the warriors with the scale shirts having a mail skirt extend beneath their shirt as a way of providing defense for their upper legs. Some in the unit have plate pauldrons as well as plate vambraces, while others lack pauldrons entirely. Some of the troops also have leather gorgets, which while stylish aren't really useful or historical. Finally, for shin protection, they all have plate greaves. For weapons, they all have longbows as well as axes, which is more historically authentic than all the troops carrying swords, which some other factions do, given that axes were far more ubiquitous weapons than swords. Their longbow seems to be identical to that of the prior unit and just as historically accurate. One bit of equipment the unit surprisingly has are round shields slung onto their backs, similar to the other round shields found in the Rohirrim roster, the main difference being that these shields are painted with a beautiful red and gold combination that matches the colour motif of the unit, who also wear red clothing but underneath their armour. Their officer is yet another standard Rohirrim officer, the only difference being his shield is painted red to match his men. As a unit, these guys are very unique and fulfill an interesting role in Rohan's roster, being effective archers who can instantly switch to very capable infantry, being a match for most medium infantry and dominating lesser units. As archers, they're capable of going toe-to-toe with other good ranged units, as their accuracy, while not as great as some other units, is better than every other archer Rohan can field, while their armour means they can withstand return fire more easily, making them hardier troops. Once out of ammunition, these soldiers double as effective infantry, actually being capable of serving on the front lines rather than as flanking forces like most other ranged units. Because this unit can fulfill two roles, it is somewhat less effective in both roles, not being the equal of high quality archers like those fielded by the Elven factions, while also not being as sturdy in melee as heavier infantry fielded by Gondor or the dwarves of Erebor. With their dual nature, you may be tempted to make infantry armies comprised mostly of these guys, hammering away at the enemy with enormous volleys before engaging them in a clash of infantry, but unfortunately for anyone attempting that strategy, only 3 of this unit can be in an army, meaning that unless you plan on only using a few archers, the garrison of the Hornburg can only supplement your archers rather than entirely replace them. Also of important note is the fact that this unit can potentially serve as a general unit, being the cheapest one available to the faction. While I'd probably consider it the worst general unit Rohan can field due to the lack of impact it can have on the battlefield, when playing as a defender in a siege, this is always an option to consider, even if it isn't as useful as the Guard of the Golden Hall in my opinion. Overall, a good unit that serves Rohirrim armies well. However, given that Rohan's overwhelming focus is on cavalry, the fact that they aren't as amazing as other factions' archers isn't surprising. With the garrison of the Hornburg looked at, all of Rohan's infantry, be they melee or ranged, have been covered, so we'll move over to the core of their army, their cavalry, starting with the first of their melee cavalry, the Esquires of Rohan, a unit that I think Merry the Hobbit technically falls into, after he's taken into the service of King Theoden. Looking at the unit, they're medium cavalry who utilize swords to cut down the enemy rather than the lance or spear on the charge. Their helmets are much of what we've seen before, some having composite leather helmets while others have fully metal helmets. For body armor, they all have leather pauldrons, metal vambraces, and leather greaves with metal strips attached, which is something that I believe was utilized in the Viking era as a way of having leg protection at a time when plate armor for the body was practically non-existent. Their main protection, of course, are leather cuirasses, some of which are pure leather with patterns shaped into them, a property leather was known for, which made it preferential to padded armor when it came to having emblems crafted into it. Others wear what I'm assuming are segmented breastplates covered in leather, somewhat similar to brigandines, although I can't tell if that's what the armor is going for, or if it's purely a leather cuirass with metal engraved into the leather as a way of decoration and added sturdiness and protection. Others have leather lamellar armor, which was also in use in Japan, although whether or not this style is accurate to real-life examples is something I don't know. Completing the look, some have more basic folds made of a single plate covered in leather to some degree for defense for their upper legs, attached to their cuirass via leather straps, an interesting depiction of earlier folds before fully lobstered plate folds came into use. For their swords and shields, they have the standard round Rohirrim shield edged in leather, although somewhat smaller than the infantry counterpart, while their sword is a standard one-handed Viking-era sword. Their horses are mostly unarmoured, even lacking caparisons, with their only armour they have being head protection, either being made of sculpted leather or scale. Their officer is just as standard as the rest, just being mounted, so we'll turn to their unit's role. As melee cavalry, the esquires of Rohan are inferior on the charge to shock cavalry and spear cavalry. However, hitting enemy formations from the rear with them still causes a lot of damage. One thing to note is that in the current version of the mod, melee cavalry is somewhat rarer than shock or spear cavalry, meaning that in addition to the cavalry support Rohan receives, which many factions don't, its cavalry is also far more diverse in battlefield roles. Unlike other cavalry units, they are meant to get stuck into battle, not being able to match shock cavalry on the charge, but being capable of swarming them once their charge is petered out. For running down light enemy infantry such as archers or matching other archers, this unit is quite useful, giving your heavier cavalry the opportunity to handle other units, or these guys tie down lesser enemies, including light cavalry, which they can run down. In melee, this unit does somewhat suffer given their lack of effective armor, but they make up for it in their skill, unfortunately not making up for it when facing ranged units, which can decimate the esquires of Rohan if allowed to loose on them. For most Rohirrim army builds, this unit will find a place, even if they are overshined by other cavalry in the mod. Rohan has however not one, but two melee cavalry units, the other being the Aered of the Westfold, horsemen levied from Rohan's western provinces as the name suggests. While their horses are equipped identically to the esquires of Rohan, their riders are not, essentially being identically equipped to the garrison of the Hornburg, except on horseback, having the same superior scale and mail shirts and coats used by the archer unit, compared to the leather armor used by the previous unit. With the same red shields and axes as the garrison of the Hornburg, there's not much to talk about, except for the fact that axes were very commonly used on horseback, both against infantry when riding them down, and against other cavalry in clashes of horse, with even medieval kings such as Robert the Bruce using an axe while mounted to kill a charging knight fighting for the English, hacking into his head through his helmet with a vicious swing. This unit definitely gets marks for historical accuracy there. Skipping their standard officer, the unit is very similar to the esquires of Rohan in terms of ability and role, the only real difference being that this unit has somewhat better armor, meaning that it can withstand melee better than the esquires of Rohan. While this would make the unit superior, the reason why it's unable to replace the esquires, and instead is used to supplement them for the most part, is because only a limited number of this unit can be brought to the battlefield, meaning they'll never be the core of an army of Rohirrim cavalry. Still a very cool looking unit, and one that really takes the idea of mounted Anglo-Saxon warriors, as envisaged by Tolkien, and makes it a reality. With the Aered of the Westfold discussed, we can move on to Rohan's next category of cavalry, its shock cavalry, starting with the first of these units, the Scouts of Rohan. This light shock cavalry unit is equipped identically to the esquires of Rohan, using the same basic leather armor design seen in use by the faction for helmets and body armor, their horses too being equipped the same as those of the esquires of Rohan. Where this unit differentiates, apart from the painted white horses some of these troops have on their helmets, are their weapons and shields, having the standard Rohirrim shield slung over their back, an axe to their side in case of close combat, and a long spear with the same metal cutout serving as a lance, with a metal spike at the end of the lance allowing it to be reused if the tip is broken, somewhat similar to the sorota used by the ancient Greeks, a similar spike attached to spears to allow them to be flipped around and still be useful, but also to finish off enemies lying on the ground by stabbing them. Their officer is what we've seen before, so not much to see there. As a unit, the Scouts of Rohan are a core part of any early Rohirrim army build, providing you with the shock capabilities the faction is known for at a cheap price, although that cheapness and early access is reflected in their quality. While needed without a doubt to make Rohan's strategy of using its infantry as an anvil against which to hammer the enemy, as a hammer this unit has much to be desired, apart from its shock capabilities, which are still quite impressive, easily being capable of destroying enemy units when hitting them from the back, and being a terror of exposed ranged units. That said, the weaknesses of this unit are varied. Its poor armor combined with its limits of shock cavalry, meaning that keeping this unit away from prolonged combat is a must, being especially allergic to spears and pikes. Against ranged units, this unit is also an easy target if left stationary, as while its speed allows it to escape enemy bowshot, when being focused down on, their lack of armor, both for the riders and the horses, means that death is likely. Once you get better shock cavalry, this unit still has a use, being good at harassing light enemy units with its presence. Just keep in mind that in clashes of shock cavalry, this unit will not do well, and against melee cavalry, once getting their charge off, leaving them behind to fight is a mistake. A cool unit with surprising usefulness despite its militia status. The next shock cavalry unit in Rohan's roster are the Aerid of the Eastfold, a somewhat heavier cavalry unit that comes from Rohan's eastern provinces. For their armor, these guys are equipped identically to the Eorling men-at-arms, the only difference being this unit lacks scaled pauldrons to defend their upper arms, so we won't continue to talk about their armor. Their horses are likewise equipped, so the same goes for them. For weapons, this unit uses the standard Rohirrim shield, this time however held to protect the front, unlike being slung over the back like the scouts of Rohan. For a lance, they wield identical long spears to the previous unit, so not much to say there, except that they use Viking-era swords when stuck in melee, showing off their superior status compared to the axes of the scouts. Skipping their standard officer, will jump to their role, and it's identical to the scouts of Rohan, essentially being more armoured versions of them, were slightly more durable in melee and against archers, even though the same threats to the scouts are also deadly to this unit. While this unit is better than the scouts of Rohan, much like the Aerid of the Westfold, the Aerid of the Eastfold is also incapable of replacing their inferior counterparts, given that this unit also has a limit placed on how many can be in an army of Rohan. Overall, a cool unit that gives Rohan more depth, however it's overshadowed by the next shock cavalry unit that Rohan has, the Knights of the Mark. This unit of heavy shock cavalry is the same as the one commanded by Éomer, so we've essentially looked at their equipment as well as those of their horses, being a clear step up from the previous two shock cavalry units. Their officer is a standard officer, which is a letdown compared to Éomer. On the battlefield, these guys are your go-to shock cavalry for medium-tier armies as well as elite armies, easily being capable of crushing other shock cavalry in clashes, as well as being able to handle fighting against most melee cavalry. On the charge against enemy units, they're absolutely devastating, while their armor means ranged units are far less dangerous to them than to the other shock cavalry units. The only major threat this unit faces being pikes and spears, as well as being trapped by polearms, a very useful unit which will be the spear tip of your army and the hammer which crushes your enemies. Just like Éomer's personal unit, the stock version of this unit can serve as a general, being a slightly cheaper general option that still has the usability a good cavalry general unit should have, although it is outshined by other prospective general units like those led by members of the royal family. Moving on from the great Knights of the Mark, we have the even more amazing Knights of the House of Eorl. Given we've practically covered this unit twice when looking at Theoden and Theodred's retinues, we'll skip them and their horses' equipment, as well as their officer who pales in comparison to Theoden. On the battlefield, this unit is a terror, being capable of demolishing just about anything that gets in its way, even spear formations which it can break, although often at the cost of heavy casualties in a frontal charge. In battle against other cavalry, this unit almost always comes out on top. While charging against enemy rears, there's barely any who can match this unit for the damage it can wreak. To balance this phenomenal damage, this unit is highly limited, with a maximum of 2 being allowed in any army, meaning that apart from the astronomical amounts of money required to have a force made up fully of knights of the House of Eorl, such an army build is impossible. This unit can also serve as a general, not just its special versions with Theoden and Theodred, giving you a general unit that's practically identical to those two units. An amazing unit for the faction, and one which when serving as general has the speed and power to enable it to avoid being sniped and to serve as a strategic reserve capable of changing the course of battle. Practically the best unit Rohan has when looking at quality, and something all armies would benefit from, even if they're not quite strictly necessary for the most part. With the Rohan's ultimate shock cavalry looked at, we'll now turn to its sole spear cavalry unit, the Riders of Rohan. This unit of cavalry, equipped entirely with male hauberks, which makes them stand out from the other units in Rohan's roster with their leather and scale, is quite cool looking, the rest of their armor and shields being seen before in other units. For weapons, they use a regular spear rather than a lance or long spear, which is more in line with what Anglo-Saxon cavalry would look like if it actually existed to a meaningful degree. Having the same relatively unarmoured horses and the same standard officer, This unit is essentially the midpoint of all of Rohan's cavalry, being useful in a shock role, but not being capable of causing as much damage as pure shock cavalry, while its melee skills and endurance means it's capable of seeing pitched battles and surviving. Against archers, the unit fares poorly when on the receiving end of their bows, like most of the cavalry that Rohan fields, most likely due to their horses being easy targets due to their lack of armor. When among archers, it can tear them apart, although very elite and armored archers may be able to put up more of a fight, while this unit's weakness against pikes and spears doesn't make it incapable of destroying infantry when flanking or attacking them from the rear. Overall, this unit should be the core of your cavalry force, and by extension your army, adding extra weight and support when on the offensive, while being capable of tying down enemy cavalry and neutralizing them when playing defensively, ultimately being very balanced and a very crucial unit to victory as Rohan. The riders of Rohan covered will now turn to yet another unit the faction can field, its single-ranged cavalry unit, the Aerid of the Gap, hailing from the lands near the gap between the mountain ranges of the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains. In terms of equipment, this unit tends to have the most basic leather and composite helmets available, while for body armor, they all wear scale cuirasses with leather braces. Strapped over their backs, they have the standard Rohirrim round shield for extra protection, while as a weapon they use a short bow, which makes sense given that full-length longbows are pretty much impossible to use on horseback, the best mounted archers in history instead using recurve bows as a way of having a powerful weapon in a small package. While it may seem odd that this unit doesn't use recurve bows given their effectiveness, Rohan is a civilization that focuses on melee cavalry, and especially shock cavalry, first and foremost, so it makes sense that mounted archers will be more of an afterthought than anything else, not necessarily using the best military technology available, combined with the fact that while the Rohirrim do live on open plains for the most part, they're farmers rather than nomadic herders, which the best mounted archers tended to be, the Rohirrim also not seeing tribal conflict in their society, conflict which drove innovation for the steppe peoples of Eurasia. The horses of this unit are lightly armoured, which also makes sense, given this unit wants to deplete enemy strength from range, which means having to avoid direct conflict as quickly as possible. Skipping their officer, we'll get into the unit's role. The Aerid of the Gap provides Rohan's armies with mobile range support, harassing the enemy and generally forcing them to be reactive to your strategies rather than to take the initiative. While this unit is pretty mediocre in terms of damage, accuracy, and ability to absorb damage, either from opposing archers or in melee, the unit is useful and when out of arrows can be used as shock cavalry against enemy infantry, even if it won't be quite that useful. Because there is a limit on how many of these an army of Rohan can have, it means that an army comprised primarily of mounted archers is a strategy unavailable to the faction. Generally, this unit can be a nice addition to Rohan's armies, however it isn't a critical component and can be done without. Finally, we turn to the last unit in Rohan's roster, the Onager, the one unit of artillery Rohan can use. With a crew comprised entirely of sword thanes without shields, this unit, just like every other Onager, gives Rohan siege capabilities, something this faction more than others desperately needs, given its specialization in battle on the open field. Without it, Rohan would be forced to rely on its relatively small pool of infantry units to storm enemy strongholds, a recipe for disaster. That said, while this is quite a unit for Rohan to use, it's also fielded by every other faction, meaning that other factions that Rohan faces off against can equal them when it comes to artillery duels, which can be quite a hassle when playing as Rohan, given you need this artillery to make successful attempts of capturing enemy fortifications. Overall, Rohan is an amazing faction, among my favourites in the mod, definitely one of my favourites in Tolkien's Legendarium. With a predisposition for heavy cavalry, this faction plays very differently to the others in the mod, utilising heavy cavalry to crush the enemy by cycle charging them to death. While this means that the infantry units Rohan have are relatively stunted in terms of growth and ability, ranging from poor to average for the most part, they are nevertheless indisposable if attempting to hit the enemy like a train when playing as Rohan. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate it. Rise of Mordor looks like it's getting an update, but before I cover whatever changes occur as a result of that update, I'm going to first create the next video in this series, looking at the last faction currently available in the mod. This is your host Jakov, signing out.